Hey everyone. So today we're going to continue looking at public opinion. So in past classes, we've looked at what are the sources of public opinion, attitudes, ideology, stuff like that. And we've also talked about how ideology and our attitudes and values tend to be quite stable. So today we're going to talk a little bit about why public opinion tends to be so unchanging. Why is it that our ideology, our attitudes are so resistant to change once they form? So once socialization has occurred, public opinion remains relatively static for several reasons. So these include selective exposure to media. We've talked already a little bit about how people choose media sources that present a message that they like. So if you tend to be more conservative, you'll choose a more conservative media source. If you tend to be more liberal, you'll choose a more liberal media source. And so you're only going to be viewing stories and perspectives that already fit with your existing perspective, and you're not going to see kind of perspectives that or arguments that run contrary to your beliefs. And if you do, if they do have, say, for example, on a liberal newscast or discussion piece, if they may have the token conservative, but you're going to be seeing everyone kind of beat up on that person and talk about how their arguments don't make sense. Second would be social group of like-minded people. So to a large extent, kind of the social networks that we embed ourselves in tend to be made up of people who think similarly, right? So, within your family group, for example, now, not to say that everyone within the same family thinks the same way, but because a large portion of socialization is at the family level, right? You're likely within kind of some of your core family, and once you choose even, a spouse, you're likely to choose someone who will share some of your ideas. Your friends, right? You're going to make friends with people who typically you're comfortable with, and you're more likely to be comfortable with people who view the world in a similar way to you, right? And so if you build a social network of people who think similar to you, then again, you're going to have, you're not going to be exposed to different viewpoints. And so you're never going to really have to think critically about your ideas. Your ideas are never really going to be challenged. If you didn't have a group of like-minded people, if your social network were more diverse, then yes, you'd be seeing more different perspectives, right? And so you'd be kind of challenged to think more critically about your attitudes and your beliefs about politics. But given that that tends not to be the case, that people prefer like-minded social groups, we don't see as much of this. And then individual psychology, right? And so there are certain kind of heuristics and biases that we use. So kind of some elements of individual psychology that leads us to not challenge kind of our existing beliefs, to interpret information in ways that fits with kind of our existing modes of belief. So we're going to talk a lot about kind of the individual psychology component today. We've already talked a little bit about the selective exposure with our discussions of media, and so this time it'll be a little bit more on individual psychology. So how do we handle new information? So ideally, what we would have is that, so you start with kind of your pre-existing belief, right? And so, for example, say we're talking about, your perspective on how much crime there is in Montreal, right? And you've got a pre-existing belief about how much crime there is in a given year in Montreal. And then you are shown new information, and you then evaluate that information objectively based on, the source of the information. So did you get the information from, some random website, or did you get it from, academic sources, or from, the Montreal Police Service, or from the government? Where did you get the information? And so the more credible the information, the more weight you give it. And then you update your beliefs based on that information. So if the information shows that crime is more common than you believe, then you adjust upwards your impression of crime. And if the stats show that crime is less common than you believe, then you adjust your beliefs downward in terms of how much crime there is. And how much you adjust your belief depends on the credibility of the source. But important to this kind of view of how we should be handling new information, or at least this normative, so this kind of belief about how it would be appropriate to be doing it, is a requirement that the collection and integration of new information be kept independent of one's prior judgment, right? So our prior judgment can't, if we're going to be doing kind of this kind of normatively, most people would say kind of objective updating of new information, if we're able to interpret or integrate new information objectively, that would require that how we collect new information not be influenced by our existing beliefs. So for example, not be influenced by choosing media sources, right? The new information that you're going to get is probably going to depend, say, for example, on your media source. So it can't be, and individual psychology can also play a role in collection, and also in terms of integration, right? So how do we interpret the source? Does that depend, or the credibility of the source, does that depend on our pre-existing beliefs? How likely are we to adjust our beliefs? Even if we agree that the source is credible, how much do we adjust our beliefs, right? Does that depend on our prior beliefs? So if for example, say you believe crime is high, and you have a kind of a belief system that believes that criminality is high, and you get information that's actually higher than you believe, then in that case maybe you're more like you might update your information. But if you believe that criminality is high and you get information that crime is actually quite low, you might be less likely to update your beliefs, right? And so that would be a biased updating of information, right? If the new information kind of conforms with your worldview, you might be willing to adjust it even to go into higher levels of problem. But if it goes against your view and challenges that crime is a problem, then you might be less likely to update it, and that would be then problematic from kind of viewing updating of information critically, or sorry, objectively. So in fact, policy beliefs often resist change. Cognitive mechanisms such as selective attention to confirming evidence, denial, source derogation, and biased assimilation of contradictory evidence buffer belief from refutation. So some of these we'll talk more about in a little bit, but just briefly, for example, selective attention to confirming evidence. So if we see, say you get a whole list of different stats on crime, right? And some would lead someone to believe that crime is high, or some are consistent with the belief that crime is high, and some are consistent with the belief that crime is low. And if you believe that crime is high, then you might just pay attention to the information that's consistent with the view that crime is high, and completely ignore and pretend that the information that's consistent with the opposite view, you might just completely ignore it. Or someone who believes crime is low might pay attention to other statistics and ignore the ones that paint the picture of crime being high, right? So everybody comes out of looking at the same statistics, believing that their view is bolstered. Denial. So just denial, if you're faced with information that's contradictory to your belief, you just deny its existence. Source derogation. So this is where we don't attack the information, we attack the source, right? So one of the things that we already talked about in terms of updating beliefs is based on kind of the credibility of the information, right? And so say you're presented again with stats on the level of crime, and the information goes against kind of your belief. Rather than one way that you can get rid of this as being problematic in terms of updating your beliefs is that you could just say, oh, well, I don't believe this source. This source is biased. It's not producing accurate information. Say that the information comes from the police. Well, the police is putting out this information because they want to get increased funding. And so they're putting out these biased stats, and these aren't real stats. They're just doing this for kind of their own purposes. And so we can't believe this information. We shouldn't adjust our beliefs based on that. And so, for example, kind of related to some of these different biases, people were slow to accept that the Earth was round because they maintained their earlier understanding that the planet was flat. You see all kinds of different places where people are slow to update their beliefs about how the world works. If you take a look at climate change, for example, the amount of people who just, despite overwhelming evidence in favor of climate change, using multiple mechanisms that we just kind of introduced, people will will kind of find ways to maintain their belief that climate change doesn't exist or that it's not man-made or whatnot. So we're going to look now at some of the kind of different heuristics and biases that we might find. So here in a second, 3 words are going to flash across the screen. And so in a second, and so I want you to see if you can read which of the words that you can read. So 3, 2, 1. All right, so what words did you see? And I believe it was a take, cake, and rake were the 3 words. And when it's a little bit harder by video to see, kind of do a polling of what words you saw, but usually everybody saw cake, and then some people saw take, some people saw rake, some people saw words that weren't there as well. But the one that was most commonly seen was cake, and you know, oftentimes students are hungry, particularly depending on what time of day you're watching this. And so the way you're feeling can filter how you interpret the world. So if you're hungry, right, and you see something about, and you see different words, you may be more likely to capture or to kind of to capture the word cake and to view it. And so how we, you know, each of the different words were showed up on screen for the exact same amount of time, but our brain, depending on how we're feeling, may be more likely to kind of to view certain words and to kind of like to process them, right? So we saw all of them, but we draw attention to particular ones. So that's kind of just a fun kind of starting example on how even how we're feeling at a given time can affect how we interpret the world, what information we bring in. Okay, so here's an example. So I'd like you in a second, after I kind of introduce this, to pause the video and click on the link here. So normally we would do it in class and we'd go and try examples together, but it makes no sense to try kind of examples together or for me to open it, because it really requires you to try the example. So it's going to take you to a kind of a news story where you get to kind of input some information and based on the information, see whether you can solve a problem. And so I want you to kind of go read the intro to it, try solving the problem, so try inputting the information and then read the solution. Once you're done that, come back and we'll move forward and look at kind of what heuristic is playing with. It also have kind of a brief introduction to that heuristic there as well. Pause the video, go to the link, and then once you're done, come back and resume the video. All right, so for many people, so some of you may not have seen this, some of you may not have gone with kind of the typical model where we just try out rules that confirm our expectations without ever trying to disconfirm it. So some of you may not have gone along with it, but typically individuals, and I've seen this when we try it in class, and you'll have the whole class spitting out kind of things to try, and everybody just keeps spitting out different rules that kind of fit the same underlying pattern, and nobody tests anything to see, hey, wait, is there anything else that we can try that could disconfirm what we're thinking, right? Individuals tend to only search for information that would confirm their beliefs. By ignoring information that could falsify our assumptions, we can end up drawing the wrong conclusions, right? So in that case, there's multiple different possible kind of patterns that could affect. But by not trying out different patterns, by just kind of sticking to the one that seemed intuitive and just seeing, okay, everything, we've tried out multiple, all of these fit that same pattern, right? But so would of other rules also fit that exact same pattern. And so without trying to disconfirm it, we end up potentially coming to the wrong conclusion and not seeing, you know, that there are other possibilities. So confirmation bias also applies to memory. People are more likely to remember information that fits their expectations, right? So when we think back to an event, right, we're biased in how we remember events in our lives, right? And that'll go along with kind of our expectations for how that event would go. So nobody, if they think back to something that happened, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, has an objective kind of recall of that event. So there definitely is kind of, and so again, if you're trying to process the political world, then all you ever look for is information that confirms your beliefs, so you never actually try to disconfirm your beliefs, then it's more likely that you're just going to find a pattern of information that can be consistent with your view, or can be interpreted in a way that's consistent with your view. And because you're never looking for anything that could possibly be inconsistent with it, then you're never going to kind of challenge your view. So observer expectancy effect, our expectations can unconsciously influence how we perceive an outcome. And so in science, we often use, for example, double-blind experimental design was created. So for example, in a scientific study, say with drugs, so for example, some people get a sugar pill and some people get a medicine, right? And whether you get a sugar pill or a medicine, you shouldn't know, right? Because if part of why we do kind of give a sugar pill and medicine is to control for kind of the placebo effect, that just by taking something, you get into a more positive psychological standpoint of I should be getting better, and just that changing kind of your psychology can actually have benefits, in improving. So for example, testing out a kind of a medicine, you may see improvements even if the person's not taking it, a drug. Now, if somebody more knew they were taking the sugar pill, right, then they you'd get rid of kind of this psychological benefit, and so kind of the entire idea of this control group would go away, and so we wouldn't be able to know which portion of the person getting the medicine is based on change in psychology and which portion is based on just the medicine being good. So people never know whether they're getting the placebo or the medicine. But you also don't want the experimenter to know whether the person's getting the placebo or the medicine, so the sugar pill or the medicine, right? Because if they then act differently towards those who are getting the medicine, they act towards the people who are getting the medicine as if they should be getting better. And if they act towards the people who are getting the sugar pill as if they should not be getting better, the person could potentially read off of the experimenter, right? So they could read off of, oh, well, this experimenter thinks I should be getting better, so, oh, I must be getting the medicine, I'll do better. Oh, this experimenter doesn't, seems to kind of be skeptical at any progress I'm making, so I'm not getting the medicine, I shouldn't be getting better. And so I guess I know I'm getting the placebo, and oh well, I'm not going to be seeing any effects. And so it's important also for the researcher not to know what they're getting, so that they can objectively kind of observe. They don't bring in any of their expectations into how they observe it, right? So they don't view, if they see the exact same, if they know that the person's getting, they could take the exact same kind of observation, see the exact same effects, but interpret them differently, right? So say you see a slight change in behavior. The way that you interpret the behavior could depend on what you expect. And so much of, and this doesn't just apply in science, right? So much of, our day-to-day interactions with the world around us involves observation, right? And so it's important to remember that how we observe, the observations we make and the interpretations we make based on those observations. So what we choose to observe and how we interpret those observations depends on what we expect. Choice support a bias. So after making a choice between options, people tend to emphasize the positive aspects of their selected option and downplay the negative aspects of their option. Conversely, they'll emphasize the negative aspects of the non-selected option and ignore their positive features. So for example, imagine you went to buy a new dog or to pick up a new dog, and you walk in and there's all kinds of dogs there that you could choose, right? And at first, it's a really tough choice because they're all so cute and playful and amazing, right? And so it's a really tough choice. Which one do you want to bring home to have as a family dog? But as soon as you get home, right, all you're going to remember are the positive aspects of the choice. If you're going to think back, um, oh, should have I taken that other dog? You may have been like 50-50 on two dogs, but as soon as you get home, right, and you get to know that dog a little bit more, and you think back to that choice, you become 100% certain that you made the right choice. And because you'll emphasize all of the amazing things of you'll remember all the kind of the really positive aspects of the dog that you chose, and forget the negative aspect, the things that made you question, maybe I shouldn't take it because, this breed isn't as good with children, or this breed isn't as good for this, or stuff like that. You're going to forget all the negative parts that made you question whether you should take this dog. You're just going to remember the positive aspects. And then with the other dogs you didn't choose, you're going to remember the negative aspects, right? So, oh, well, this breed we don't want, right? Even though you were so close to taking it, and you're not going to remember, how cute it was and all the other great aspects of it. So kind of everyone ends up believing that they have, the best dog in the world. And you guys may have great dogs, but my dog's the best in the world. Okay, so next, and that's not my dog, too. Mine's way cuter, and okay, might have spaghetti fall on its head at some point, possibly could happen, but all right, fundamental attribution error. And so this involves actor-observer difference in attribution. So attribution is how we assign cause. So what's the cause of something that happened? And so the fundamental attribution error is the belief that negative behaviors of others are caused by dispositions, so by character traits, but our own negative behaviors are caused by situational factors. Conversely, the positive behavior of others are caused by situational factors, whereas our own positive behaviors are caused by our dispositions, right? So, for example, if I do well on a test, it's because, so a positive event, because I'm smart. Where somebody else does well on a test, we don't necessarily view it as because they're smart, it's because it was an easy test. Where if I do badly on a test, if I do poorly on a test, it's because the test was too hard, or because the teacher was biased in how they graded it. They graded me unfairly, or because of some situation, at home. There was construction outside my window, so I couldn't focus in studying, right? So I wasn't able to study well for it. Whereas if other people do poorly, it's because they're lazy, or they're not very smart, or they're not very good at this. And so it says something about their character. And so the way that we interpret information, right? So if another politician, right? If somebody who, if somebody, from an opposing group in a kind of a political context does something negative, we're going to view it as being, oh, it's because, they're just bad people. They're evil people. They believe this. They're violent people. Whereas a member of our own group does the exact same thing that we would normally say is bad, it's because of the context, right? It's a situation. They were forced into doing it. They had no choice. The situation forced it, right? And so what ends up happening is all the bad things that our group does, right? People who share our views, all the bad things that they do get explained away, right? So we continue viewing ourselves as good, and all the bad things that our group does, it's because of the situation. We are forced into it. Where all the bad things that the other group does, so if you're conservative, all the bad things that liberals do, because liberals are bad. It's not the context that forces them to do it. It's because they're bad. And so everything, all behaviors, right, whether they're good or bad, end up still supporting your belief that the other side is bad. And all what things that you do or your group does, whether they're good or bad, still support your view that you're good, right? Because the bad stuff gets explained away and the good stuff supports your view. And for the other group, the bad stuff they do supports your view or reinforces your view, and the good stuff they do gets explained away. So nobody can change, no group can really change their reputation. There's also, so many of these are kind of just like automatic or unmotivated by, so that's not things that we're trying to do to support our view. It's just kind of unconscious how we interpret information. There's also forms of reasoning that are more motivated. So they're goal oriented. So the way that we process information in pursuit of certain goals. So in reasoning about politics, people are goal oriented, and these goals can include accuracy goals and partisan goals, right? So accuracy goals, just that, people, for the most part, they want to have accurate interpretations of the world. So people are motivated to seek out and carefully consider relevant evidence so as to reach a correct or otherwise best conclusion. Nobody wants to be wrong, right? So people always, to a certain extent, when they're approaching politics or any situation, wants to get good information. Nobody sets out to be wrong. Even people who are consistently wrong, right? They're still trying to be right, and they believe they're right. But there's also partisan goals, right? So yes, we want to be right, but we also have a set of goals related to our partisan goals. So motivates them to apply their reasoning powers in defense of a prior specific conclusion. So if I'm a liberal, I want to use my reasoning to come to a liberal conclusion, right? And to support the liberal cause. And if I'm conservative, I want to use my reasoning in defense of kind of conservative values. If I'm pro-gun control, right? Then I want to interpret information. My goal is to kind of interpret information in a way that it supports gun control. If I'm against gun control, then I want to interpret things in a way like that helps support that goal, because part of what I really want is getting to a certain end result. And so I want to be bringing in information. I'm motivated to find information that supports my cause. So Taper and Lodge, kind of in the reading, they make the argument that partisan goals and subsequent selective information processes are driven by automatic, effective, so kind of related to emotion, processes that establish the direction and strength of biases, right? So part of some of the biases that we see in how people respond to information, some of it's just based on just basic heuristics that people just automatically, without even thinking about goals, interpret information in a certain way. It's just kind of how we're hardwired to kind of automatically process the world. We can't filter everything, right? We can't process all the information out there, so we need shortcuts. And so some of what we see as kind of even the things that kind of support or that lead to public opinion or the perseverance, right? It's just related to those unmotivated goals. It's just how we process information. But that some of it's also driven by more kind of effective processes where we're trying to support a goal, right? And so we're interpreting information and it's goal oriented. It's not necessarily purposeful in the sense of like we're aware when we're doing it that this is the reason that we're doing it. But it's related to, so it still can be automatic, but it still fits kind of within the purposeful goal of our purposeful partisan goals. So they develop a series of hypotheses about different effects and biases that we're going to be seeing that could be related to motivated reasoning. So the first being prior attitude effect. People who feel strongly about an issue, even when encouraged to be objective and leave their preferences aside, will evaluate supportive arguments as stronger and more compelling than opposing argument. So even if I tell you, I want you to be critical of both viewpoints. So I'm going to present you with a pro-gun control argument and a anti-gun control argument. And I want you to be objective. I tell you, I want you to be objective in how you read this. People who are pro-gun control are more likely to interpret the pro-gun control argument as being stronger than the anti-gun control argument, and vice versa for those who are anti-gun control. Confirmation bias. People will spend more time and cognitive resources denigrating and counter-arguing attitudinally incongruent than congruent arguments. So essentially this means that people, when you're presented with an argument that you don't like, so again, if you're pro-gun control, you're presented with an anti-gun control argument, you're going to spend time trying to disconfirm it. You're going to spend energy trying to argue against this to show why this argument is wrong, right? So your goal is to, remember before we talked about confirmation bias, where your goal is essentially just to confirm your belief. In this case, your goal here is to disconfirm, right? So you're not going to look for any evidence that could potentially support the argument. You're going to look for any evidence or any logic that can disconfirm the argument. The flip side would be the confirmation bias. When free to choose what information they'll expose themselves to, people will seek out confirming over disconfirming argument, right? So if you're given the choice of what you're going to be looking at, so what information are you going to be looking for, you're going to look for information that's going to confirm. So if you get to kind of say you get the choice of looking at two different articles. One is a pro-gun control article, and one's an anti-gun control one, and kind of their opinion pieces that are building the argument. If you're pro-gun control, you're going to choose to read the pro-gun control argument because it's going to help confirm, and it's going to go along with what you view. You're not going to choose to read the one that will challenge your viewpoint. Attitude polarization. So as a result, attitudes will become more extreme even when people have been exposed to a balanced set of pro and con arguments. So even if you're not going even if you didn't get to choose which of the two, even if you were forced into seeing both, right? Because of what we had before, the prior attitude effects and disconfirming bias, right? So that you're going to view as stronger the ones that you view with, and you're going to spend time trying to disconfirm the opposing arguments. It's going to actually lead to become more extreme, right? The more information you get, because you're going to disconfirm opposing arguments, and you're going to view the ones that fit your beliefs as giving more and more evidence. Attitude strength effect. Those citizens voicing the strongest policy attitudes will be more prone to motivate skepticism. So those who are more tied up with, who care more about a particular viewpoint, are those who are more likely to use all of these processes to kind of be motivated reasoning processes to kind of support their attitude, right? So for example, take two people who are pro-gun control. A person who's really, really, really pro-gun control, right? Is very motivated to protect their view. Or say someone, they're pro-gun control, but they don't particularly care. It's not that important of an issue to them. They're not going to want to, it's not that costly for their sense of self, or for their individual psychology if they find out that they're wrong, or if they see something counter-attitudinal, right? They're not that invested in protecting it. They're not that motivated to protecting those beliefs. Also, sophistication effect. The politically knowledgeable, because they possess greater ammunition with which to counter-argue incongruent facts, figures, and arguments, will be more susceptible to motivated bias. This essentially kind of fits along with the kind of the disconfirmation bias. People who know more about politics, right, are going to have more weapons to use to try to disconfirm arguments they don't like. Or people who are less sophisticated in their political knowledge, they may not like the counter arguments that they see. For example, say they have to read kind of a pro and a con. They may not they may not like the idea of the opposing viewpoint, but they don't know enough about the subject to be able to say that it's wrong. So they have trouble, they could be more persuaded, or they can't defeat that information, and so it has to give more weight. Or someone who's more sophisticated can take that opposing argument, and any argument is likely to have weaknesses, and they know more, and so they can point to these weaknesses, which makes it easier for them to dismiss. So here's some of the results, and just kind of want to talk through. So in this case, so the height of bars, I know this is a little bit more complicated of a figure. I'm never going to ask you explicitly, like in the test, on the figure. It's more just the general conclusions that could come up. But so the taller the bar is interpretation of the strength of the argument. A black bar means that the person saw a pro argument, so they're giving their interpretation about the strength of a pro argument. A gray bar means that the respondent is giving interpretation of the strength of a con argument. And then we have kind of designations based on whether the person's beliefs is pro or con on the issue. So say gun control, are they pro or con? And are they unsophisticated, sophisticated, weak, or strong? And generally speaking, across all of these, there's some variation on the issues, whether it's the gun control study 1, gun control study 2, affirmative action 1 or 2. But across most of them, first, there's a general pattern that people who are pro on a particular issue find that the pro argument is stronger than the con argument, and people who are against a particular issue believe that the con argument is stronger than the pro argument. That's generally true for most of these studies in general. There's also, in general, for most of the studies, these effects are stronger for those who are politically sophisticated versus those who are not sophisticated. So, for example, looking somewhere like here, right, there's very little difference. So like here, there's very little difference for those who, so if we're looking at affirmative action one, there's very little difference in kind of perception of strength of argument for those who are unsophisticated. There's a huge difference for those who are sophisticated. And same thing goes for weak versus strong. Those who have strong beliefs, you see a big difference in how they perceive the strength of a pro or con argument based on their pre-existing beliefs. That's less case for those who are weak, who have weak kind of partisan goals here. So those who really believe, for example, in this case in affirmative action, right, who really believe, they're really attached to these, and so they're very motivated to view the world in a certain way, where those who have only weak kind of attitudes towards affirmative action, whether they be pro or con, are less attached to it, and so they're less emotionally kind of going to push their reasoning towards viewing the information in a consistent way. So denigrating views that go against their belief and supporting views that fit their beliefs. Here we have read time for argument strength ratings. And so what's interesting, so in this case, read time you can view as being important. So we see that people typically spend more time reading arguments that go against their beliefs. And so congruent arguments, so the black bars are arguments that fit your belief. So if you're pro an issue, you read a pro argument, that's congruent. If you're against an issue and you read a con issue, that's congruent. It fits your beliefs. And then congruent ones, so the gray bars are views that go against your beliefs. So if you're pro, you read a con argument. If you're against an issue, you read a pro argument. And people spend more time when they are forced to read both. They spend more time reading the argument incongruent. And the argument here for spending more time is that you're trying to disprove the argument. You're trying to. So some of the hypotheses were about how you spend time trying to disconfirm arguments that don't fit your reasoning, where you just kind of automatically accept. You don't have to spend much time lingering on those that are congruent with your belief, because you just automatically accept them. You don't have to process them really. You just internalize them. You're like, yep, that makes sense to me, move on. Where those that don't make sense to you, you're like, I've got to show why this is wrong. I have to, find the fault in this argument. Maybe it's the source was bad. Maybe their interpretation was bad. So their methods was bad. Anything like that. And to further kind of fit with that mean number of thoughts. So if people could write down kind of their thoughts on the different argument, the mean number of thoughts presented for congruent and incongruent arguments, and particularly for all respondents, but particularly for high knowledge individuals, they spend a lot more time. So they spend a little bit of time. So in terms of, so there's a little bit of confirmation bias in that they spend a little bit of time kind of bolstering the arguments that they like. But in both cases, in particular for high knowledge people, they spend the most time and the most comments attacking the arguments they don't like, trying to disconfirm the arguments they don't like. They have a strong emotional reaction to it, shown kind of in the black. They've got a strong negative emotional reaction to the arguments that they don't like, and they spend a lot of time commenting on it, a lot of effort commenting on it, trying to make an argument that this information is wrong. So challenging, trying to disconfirm. So people really try to disconfirm if they're forced to view information that they don't like. They spend a lot of time trying to disconfirm it. So kind of in conclusion, citizens are prone to overly accommodate supportive evidence. So we seek it out, and we just automatically accept it, while dismissing out of hand evidence that challenges their prior attitudes. So dismissing out of hand, and if we can't just dismiss it out of hand, then spend a lot of time trying to disconfirm it. On reading a balanced set of pro and con arguments about affirmative action or gun control. So the authors found that rather than moderating or simply maintaining their original attitudes, so you can make an argument that if you get kind of, no matter what your belief is, if you get kind of two well-written arguments on both sides, so you get you read a pro argument and a con argument, so in favor and against. One of two things would make sense to happen without kind of motivated reasoning. Either nothing happens, so you see something that, if we adjust kind of our beliefs based on kind of direction of the information, and we get something that confirms, so would push our belief upwards, and we get something that disconfirms, that pushes our belief downwards, then they may just cancel each other out. So it might be just simply maintaining your original belief. Moderating might be because you get one that fits your belief, but it doesn't really push it, shouldn't push it upwards, because it actually just confirms your belief, and you get one that pushes it pushes it downward, right? So you think gun control measures are effective, right? And you read something that makes it that says that gun control measures act exactly as you do. That shouldn't necessarily strengthen your beliefs much, because it actually just kind of fits it. So it's a little bit of supporting information, but then you also read something that shows that they really don't work. That should, if anything, you get one that kind of shows that you were about right, and one shows that you were drastically wrong. That should, in many ways, mean that you probably still believe in gun control measures, but it should weaken your belief in them. So either nothing should change, or we would think that you probably maintain your belief, but it should be weakened, so moderate it a little bit, moves kind of a little bit more towards the center. However, citizens, especially those with the strong, who feel strongest about the issues, or who are, say, the most politically sophisticated, strengthen their attitudes in ways not warranted by the evidence. So even if you read kind of the pro and con argument, you kind of completely dismiss the opposing argument that you read, and take the one that you the one that you agree with as further support. So rather than either having your beliefs not shift at all, or shift towards being more moderate, they end up shifting to becoming stronger. So even when you read kind of a balanced set of arguments, the end result is that it's as if you just read the set of arguments that fit your belief. And so through all of these kind of different processes that we talked about today, you can see how public opinion can be really hard to change, and for a variety of different, so partially it relates to kind of selective exposure, and kind of that we surround ourselves with kind of people that we believe similar things. So partially we put ourselves into environments where we're not likely to see messages that don't fit our beliefs, but partially because there's certain psychological processes that make it so that even if we get evidence that doesn't fit our belief, we're likely to kind of interpret it in a way that means that we don't update our beliefs. So even if we see kind of if you believe in affirmative action and you see evidence that affirmative action doesn't work, you're going to dismiss it and maintain your view on affirmative action. And so this helps show why public opinion and so kind of your attitudes and beliefs and ideology is so resistant to change, even in the face of kind of contradictory evidence. So that's it for today. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you next week for our next debate.